Great. So thank you, everyone, for coming. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Dr. Tommy Lynch. I'm senior lecturer in philosophy of religion here at the University of Chichester. And Andrew Smith, who is senior lecturer in contemporary history and politics, and I found ourselves a couple times over the past week having conversations about recent events in France, and then very sadly, we sort of had a conversation, and it seemed like every time we've had some sort of meeting, then there's been a subsequent attack. And in those conversations, it was interesting because we come from two different disciplinary backgrounds. I primarily work on religion from a philosophical perspective, looking at as a problem in political philosophy and social theory. And Andrew works in contemporary history in France. And so while there's a certain sort of some shared assumptions and some shared perspective, we do come at it from slightly different angles. And I had seen Andrew appear on France 24. He's their go-to British correspondent, I believe. And I thought that it was really impressive the way that he was navigating some of the questions that were being asked about recent events. And so it just made me want to talk to him more. And I thought, why not include as many people as possible in that conversation. I should say that occasionally, I'm sure both of us will reference things like that interview. And when we eventually do circulate it, I'll try to track down as much of that as possible and include it with that information. One other kind of, I don't know if it's a sort of a caveat or a qualification, but I'm a little bit conscious of the fact that, at least for philosophers sometimes, when we start to think about the kinds of challenges presented by things like the most recent events, there's a way in which that conversation can seem disconnected from the very real fact that people have been killed, and that this isn't just an abstract philosophical question or something to be debated or discussed, but is something which has impacted real people's lives and should be viewed as a tragedy. And so while we're focusing on how those attacks and the response to those attacks fit within a longer historical perspective and raise difficult philosophical and religious questions, that's in no way to diminish the reality of the violence that has been done to real people's lives. So I was having a conversation with some students earlier this week, and I always find that a little bit of a tricky balance. So I just wanted to make that point clear at the outset. So what we'll do is I'll start off by asking Andrew some questions. We'll have a bit of a conversation, and we'll do that for sort of 45 minutes or so. And then as that starts to wind down, we'll open it up to you all for questions. At which point, feel free to unmute your microphones and ask a question. You could raise your little digital hand or type a question in the chat. So Andrew, I think one of the things that struck me, one of the things that I felt like you handled quite adeptly. I mean, when I saw you doing the interview, I just thought, oh dear heavens, that seems like a very difficult conversation to have live on the news. Yeah. But one of the things that it made me wonder is that a lot of the responses have sort of taken the position, how should we French people deal with these Muslims? Which elides the fact that while the attacker in the initial attack against Samuel Paty was not French, was not a French national at least, that historically the people who are being discussed as a problem for France are themselves French. They just happen to be French people who are Muslims. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about, I know that there's this idea of communitarianism, and that seems like it means something different in France than it does in the UK or the United States. So I wondered if you could just start us off by saying a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. I think, in the first instance, I think it is quite important to recognise that most of the people we're talking about in terms of these incidents, many of them are French, and that's something that's being really, I think, quite important over the long run. Is different ideas of citizenship, different ways of understanding how French people have defined what it means to be French. But I think, and certainly from the kind of first moment, I think it is really important to state that obviously we are currently in the French Fifth Republic, and that's no kind of accident of numbering. I think it's important to remember there's been a kind of constant reformulation of the French Republic, both politically and to an extent geographically, over the 20th century. So ideas of things like citizenship are kind of categories which have never really been kind of settled in that same way that we might look at somewhere like Britain, where there's been, a far greater continuity of kind of political governance in that way. So I think, emerging out of that kind of difficult history, there is a kind of distinct history, and this becomes a contested concept as a result, ideas of citizenship and Frenchness. And it's often been something that's very, very strongly debated on that basis. Now, you mentioned ideas of communitarianism. Now, that's one I always find interesting because in French it's communautarisme, and it's one that I always struggled with how to define because, or how to translate, I should say, because communitarianism doesn't really cut it. Because, like you say, in kind of in Anglo-American, philosophy, political theory, we can talk about a kind of communitarian challenge to John Rawls's theory of justice, for example. That's got nothing to do with what French people are talking about when they mention communautarism. Communautarism is probably, if you want a safe translation, it's probably something like group identity politics, or kind of, I guess, kind of community tribalism in some ways. Again, we might be treading on kind of, thin ice using terms like tribalism. It kind of feels a slightly odd thing. Now, one of the other things is communautarism is something that emerged largely out of a very kind of reactionary space in French culture. And it was often used really by kind of people on the political right, and often the radical right. And it's kind of interesting concept. Now, it's not one that necessarily links to ideas of citizenship from way back in the French Revolution. Instead, it's one that really emerges out of kind of like intellectual debates and discussions that come out like the 1970s and 1980s. There's a great book written by a friend called Émile Chabal. He wrote a book called A Divided Republic. I mean, in that, he talks about this kind of reformulation of a lot of kind of French political certainties after the 1970s and 1980s. And that comes out of, on the first instance, the death of General de Gaulle. And, in France for the longest time, that was the kind of spectre of Gaullism defined the Fifth Republic and what it could be and what it should be. So after his death, that well kind of runs dry, and people are then kind of trying to interpret what it means, this idea of Haute de Gaulle. Incidentally, it was the 50th anniversary of his death yesterday. And I was on France 24 talking about it there. But the other thing that happens is there's a kind of discrediting of the kind of idea of kind of Soviet-style socialism and Marxism, especially in France. We move towards Eurocommunism as a kind of political trend. And from that space, we start to see a kind of redefinition of Republican values to focus a lot more on ideas of rights and trying to understand them within that context of kind of, liberal freedoms of the 1970s. And that's really where communitarism comes out of. So communitarism, as I said, kind of group identity politics. Why does that matter? That matters because the French state is defined, the French Republic is defined as universal. And that means that it sees no difference in front of it. You have a state, a republic, and you have an abstract individual citizen. And the state sees no definition of that abstract individual citizen. Now, the idea, the suspicion of communitarism is that people are trying to kind of place intermediary groups between citizen and republic, that they're trying to somehow interfere with that relationship. And that leads to kind of accusations that there is something kind of nefarious at work there. So yeah, I would kind of, in response to that question, I think that's really what we're getting at when we talk about communitarism. But also important to remember that this is like, a kind of contested history within French republicanism, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. And there's two things there that I think we could maybe talk a little bit more about. And one is that you were mentioning the kind of the different factors which result in the growing concern of communitarianism as there's this renewed focus on Frenchness. But I guess the other thing that's happening around that time is the sort of the collapse of the French colonial empire. Not quite as extensive as the British colonial empire, but still a kind of that raises all kinds of questions. And as people from those colonies are arriving in France and raising questions, I mean, do you think that the focus on communitarianism as a particular threat to the French Republic is linked to that those events in the colonies or in the collapse of the colonies, or is that sort of mistaking and trying to link up unconnected things?
Sure. Well, first things first, I won't get into a kind of Fashoda style competition of comparing Franco-British empires and their extent. But I think, it is certainly something we can look at the idea of French Empire as being intimately tied to conceptions of citizenship, conceptions of Frenchness, and latterly, as you said, patterns of immigration, for example. Now, as I said, citizenship's got a kind of long and contested and complicated history. There's a great book by Frederick Cooper, who's a fantastic historian of imperialism and of decolonization, based over in New York. He's got a fantastic moustache, if you ever see him speak in person. And he wrote a great book called Citizenship Between Empire and Nation. I think that's a really good starting point for this kind of discussion, because it talks about how this idea of citizenship emerges, in the first instance from the French Revolution, and it emerges in a kind of interesting way, because there it's about two things. First of all, it's about guaranteeing rights, and it's second of all about a kind of vehicle for kind of electing an assembly, a representative assembly, and making sure that people kind of tie into this, But likewise, it's not universally active at that stage, because we know there isn't universal suffrage. Women don't have the vote, for example. You have to be a man of a certain age to have the vote at that stage. So there are passive and active forms of citizenship within that, Now, in terms of empire, why that relates to empire is because that's really the first test of this idea of a universal republic, and it's why French historians get so kind of drawn into this idea of the Haitian Revolution, and why it figures so strongly in understandings of French history and of the French Revolution, because of course at that stage we're talking about Saint-Domingue, which is one of France's wealthiest colonies. It's the largest sugar producer in the world. And there are thousands of enslaved people living there in wretched conditions. And we start to see kind of representations to the French at this stage for some kind of emancipatory project. That happens, first of all, first of all, there's the actual slave revolt, which occurs in 1791. Then we start to see citizenship extended to freed gens de couleur, people of color. It's almost a direct translation from that term, in 1792. And then an extension after the kind of abolition of the freeing of the slaves in 1793. So there's a kind of expansion of all of that. And so great, that seems like a wonderful kind of tribute to universal citizenship and all the rest of it, except we know that the story doesn't end there. At that moment, you've got somebody like Toussaint Louverture, who represents, this like pinnacle, this ideal, this like paragon of what it means in universal republicanism, this hero of those republican ideals. And in one stage, he could be a hero of that revolution, but he's also not. Why? Because he's also a victim of the kind of the frailties and the kind of cruel betrayal of that same state. Because we know Napoleon reintroduces slavery in 1802. He kind of quells the revolt in Saint-Domingue, and that eventually declares independence in 1804. So there is there, even at that moment, a real kind of mismatch between what the ideals, the kind of the stated intent of universal citizenship and what it actually represents. And then you start to see all the back and forth of French history over the 19th century and the 20th. We see the formal abolition of slavery in 1848. There's a kind of slight extension of citizenship which occurs there. There's then kind of different ways. Algeria is the real test of this. At first it's Haiti that kind of talks about what the extent of this is. Algeria defines both the kind of the feed in and the lead out, as you said, in terms of like what happens to empire. Why? Well, Algeria is colonized in 1830. It kind of becomes in 1848 part of France. So what we mean by that is, in the same way that Hawaii is part of the United States, it's not territorially part of it, but it is understood to be connected. What that means is that there is a kind of understanding of citizenship that's extended in Algeria, but it is one that's agreed to on an individual basis. It's one in which, and this is important, Muslim Algerians have to renounce their faith in order to become citizens. Now, that's interesting because already we can see in the 19th century, this isn't a kind of, an idea of citizenship, which is always kind of about kind of Catholic white French people, if you see what I mean. This is one which extends for a long time into North Africa, one which is confronted time and again of understanding and kind of integrating a vision of what Islam is to the state as well. And I think that's really an important point to look at where Algeria is really important within this, because that is absolutely crucial. Of course, there's a couple of world wars in between then and now. There's big changes then. After after the Second World War, we see, first of all, kind of promises of imperial reform. And then people like Lamine Gueye, who push a law which is about abolishing kind of different levels of citizenship and trying to extend citizenship across the French Empire. And that tries to kind of develop that concept much more openly. Now, that's the idea of how we understand citizenship within empire. But then, as you say, what we're talking about is that period in the 1960s when we start to see an end to formal empires. And that leads to kind of, ideas of inward immigration to France, at that moment of independence and subsequently. And that is something that France kind of reckons with after that period. One of the issues there is it creates, first of all, gaps in terms of citizenship, but also levels of social inequality, where we often see quite kind of dramatic levels of poverty in France at that stage. There's some wonderful work that's being done on ideas of colonial welfare around that period. I'm thinking of colleagues that I've seen working on it. One by my colleague Ed Naylor, who's written a couple of articles on looking at ideas of asylum into France at this stage. But also there's some wonderful stuff coming up about Marseille, actually, through the Rethinking Europe seminar at the IHR, which is free to sign up for if anyone's interested. Talking again about that kind of citizenship and all the rest of it in this period. But you're right, that produces a moment where you've got a kind of formal separation of empire, a change in the kind of geographical configuration of France, and as a result, there needs to be a change in terms of what citizenship means. And that's a period in which that's wrestled with, in which the kind of the long spectre of the general is kind of brought to bear in 1958 with the formation of the Fifth Republic. I said Algeria is important. Algeria is the reason the Fourth Republic collapses. It's the reason de Gaulle comes back and founds a Fifth Republic. It's central in terms of this understanding. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Decolonization is right at the heart of this understanding. Why? Because in some ways it creates the very republic we're talking about at this moment. But sorry, that's a long way for a shortcut in terms of answering your question.
No, I think that's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting as someone who's interested in questions of race and religion is that, you sort of learn bits of history, right? But I mean, I think a lot of what you were saying there seems. Is very informative, and especially this point about the kind of the universalism. I mean, I teach about the Haitian Revolution in one of my modules, and I always say it's sort of like universal values, but not that universal. We know who the universal is really for, and one of the things I'm never quite sure of is. There's interesting work being done on the universal now as a political idea in feminist philosophy, in decolonial or post-colonial philosophy, trying to sort of redeem notions of the universal, often with an appeal to the Haitian Revolution, as sort of seeing the Haitian Revolution as that sort of the site where universal values become truly universal. But I think that the tricky thing is that the universal is always a particular universal, and how would one sort of universally express a universal is sort of unclear to me. I'm a little I don't know how I feel, because on the one hand, when people are talking about sort of universal values and rights and things, that's usually like a pretty good thing. But then also that discourse does tend to break down at some point. And I think it does, and what's happening in France in terms of the response and the kind of ongoing struggles of Muslims in France to figure out how to express their Muslimness and their Frenchness at the same time. And it seems like the challenge is, to go back to something you said earlier, is that you have the French state, who views all of its citizens as these kind of abstract individuals, free to choose whatever like little bits of identity or culture that they want to assemble in their private lives, but for political purposes, at least, as these abstract individuals. And so then when you experience some form of discrimination in whatever form, in order to identify that grievance, you have to say, I now am sort of standing before you a French Muslim or a Muslim who doesn't happen to be white. And in so doing, you are becoming particular. So it seems like there is this impossible paradox that people are caught in, where on the one hand, they want access to this universality, but in order to gain access, they have to draw attention to their particularity. And I'm not sure if there's a way around that, which is probably too much to ask you to solve the problems of the French state. But...
I think it's, you put your finger on a very difficult concept, and I think one of the difficulties of it is, again, it has a particular history. We can look at this in the interwar period, for example, with the experience of French Jews. There are differences in terms of kind of anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism as it develops in French political culture. And that occurs against a background of debates around assimilation. And that's one of the big kind of things which tracks alongside this idea of universalism as you're discussing. It becomes about understanding how different communities assimilate into a vision of universalism, a kind of, a hegemonic vision in a way. Now, when you see that in the 1930s, we see debates between, for example, kind of settled, assimilated communities of Jews in France who see themselves as French and Republican, and thereafter as Jews. And they have, for example, you see kind of inter-community discussions about how these groups then can treat or respond to influx of refugees from Eastern Europe in the face of Nazi German violence, but also fleeing kind of the Soviet Union, for example, during that interwar period. And actually, there's a lot of discussion around that, around people that are kind of incoming and unassimilated. And that really seems to be a question around this idea, how assimilation works within it. But I think it's important to say as well, as you said, what assimilation doesn't do is address socioeconomic inequality. So if there are kind of ways in which communities have experienced specific issues like that, then it becomes difficult for the French state to address that. Now, again, that can be linked to the experience of the Second World War. There's a reason that France doesn't take ethnic surveys of its citizens. It doesn't hold statistical data about how many Muslims are in France. It doesn't hold statistical data about how many Jewish people are in France. Why? Well, because part of the reason is something like the Vélodrome d'Hiver in 1942, one of the most notorious roundups of Jews in France, where you had thousands of people deported to the death camps on the basis of exactly those same types of registrations. And so there's a recognition within France that that idea of collecting data on kind of faith, on all the rest of these things, is an anti-Republican ideal. It's one which was engaged with by a state which was by its definition anti-Republican, and a kind of shame. It shamed the Republic that moment. And we saw, of course, people like Jacques Chirac in 1995 in tears, apologizing for the crimes of the Republic within that, the recognizing the complicity of French people in that roundup, for example. So there are specific reasons why those statistics aren't collected. But as you say, that then clashes with those claims towards universalism, because as you say, in order to voice a claim, one needs to kind of voice it from a position of inequality. There are moments, again, to look at the colonies where that idea of equality is used as a lever. I mentioned Fred Cooper's work, his work on the labour movements in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa are great, because he talks about this idea of the equality lever. And it basically has, the CGT, the largest communist trade union in France, would negotiate things for French workers. And then you would have the kind of the African division say, sure, yeah, that sounds great, we'll have that at the same time. And if, the pay is different, the conditions are different, why is that? What's the context for that difference? And so that was trying to draw the state into acknowledging differences of status, which the state could not do, and so was forced to meet claims for equality. But as you say, sometimes when that comes from a position of, trying to seek state intervention, there's a real issue, I think, in terms of seeing where that can actually come from.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to something you said a moment ago, the point about the kind of intergenerational differences, I think is really interesting. I mean, I'm not sure how much this relates to the people who have carried out the recent attacks, in part because we're still learning about those attacks. But I mean, one of the interesting things about work in anthropology and ethnography that are about sort of, and I am not trying to draw an equivalence between, like wearing headscarves and extremism at all, but sort of things that are viewed as signs of potential extremism. Is that, a lot of the idea is that there's all this kind of family pressure on French Muslims, which or German Muslims or British Muslims, for girls to cover their heads and to abide by fairly strict or conservative notions of Islam. But we actually find is a much more complicated picture, where often you have particularly in places like France, people whose parents are Algerian or Moroccan and aren't particularly religious, or at least religious in the way that term is often used. It's always difficult because if you are interested in religion as a social phenomenon, sometimes it's like what counts as religious. But if we think about, religious as observant, maybe. Their parents aren't particularly observant, and their religious identity is precisely a way of trying to claim back something of a political agency in the face of a state that they don't feel sees them in their complexity. And again, I mean, I think that sort of cycles back. There's a political movement in France, which I've only read a little bit about, in part because my French reading is not what I wish it was. But the indigenous of the Republic, which is trying to formulate a kind of left politics within France, but one that isn't explicitly secular, and one that is trying to acknowledge that part of what may sort of ironically be France's salvation is probably too strong a word, but part of what might initiate a new vision of France is precisely the vision of France that's held by those people who are often excluded from the vision of France, sort of publicly and politically now.
Yeah, I mean, so I think in terms of, so you mentioned ideas of schools and headscarves, right? So I think, for example, there you can see discussions that communitarism that come into it, and I think I think that represents a slightly different starting point from looking at Indigènes de la République or kind of Racisme SOS and all the kind of the groups that emerged. So if we look first of all at the idea of the various headscarf affairs, I mean, again, this speaks to the fact of this being a kind of ongoing issue. The first real kind of like affaire de foulard, as it's called in France, was in 1989, and that was about 3 schoolgirls who were expelled from their class just outside Paris in Cré, and they were made to remove headscarves and leave the class, and they left the class. And this was something which kind of rumbled on about how the French state dealt with this. The idea was at the time that people would not be able to wear the headscarf in class itself, but could wear it in the grounds of the school. It was understood in general, and again, it revives again in 1994. Again, you see this kind of focus on the fact that it says, what does it say at the time? They can't have ostentatious symbols of religious adherence because that's about proselytizing. And so there is a kind of an idea of that, that's the solution, as it were. But even then, you get young women, girls, who kind of push back against it and protest against it. There's a girl in Strasbourg who says she can't cover her hair, she'll shave her head. There's kind of pushback against these laws, which force people into doing those things. And again, it comes back in 2004 or 5, this kind of headscarf affair again about the extent to which this is allowed within it. And we can see other institutions of this. You could look at, for example, the provision of vegetarian food in canteens. That's often held because you see both vegetarian parents and Jewish and Muslim parents asking that, say, a school canteen has another option except pork. But the Republic refute. What you see there is often kind of education ministers and all the rest of it say, actually, this is about, we won't make accommodations for those individual communities because the menu is what it is, and that's what's offered, and there's no space for religious opt-outs. On this concept, I think Joan Wallace Scott is fantastic and some wonderful stuff on ideas of headscarf, but also on kind of gender equality as well, and about parité. the force of that, I think, is one that's really interesting. On people like Indigènes de la République, one of my colleagues who's based at University of Westminster, a guy called Ite Lotem, has written a lot about the idea of how anti-racist movements develop in France. And there's also some really good stuff on that by a guy that we had as a visiting professor here last year, who was somebody that actually taught Hugo when he was an undergraduate. But he's based out in South Wales, so in the current conditions, he hasn't been, coming all the way across that Sharif Ghemi. But there's some fantastic work on it that looks at the way that and another person that's worth mentioning is Daniel Gordon, who's based up at Edge Hill. These ideas of those anti-racist movements, I think, are absolutely fascinating, because what they emerge from is really trying to kind of address socioeconomic inequality. And one of the things they then engage in is exactly that kind of stuff we mentioned at the start, around where accusations of communitarism come from. I mentioned my friend Emil's work in A Divided Republic, and he says when you see these accusations of communitarism, they come from two places. There's two triggers for it. And the first is the one that groups like Indigènes de la République engage in, which is a kind of counter-narrative of the state, one which calls for a realization of the promises of the egalitarian republic, which says, actually, look at the evidence in front of you. There are inequalities in this. See them, realize them, address them. And the other is this kind of puffed up concern about what we might call kind of Anglo-Saxon multiculturalism. And those two things in kind of in tandem are what usually then elicit this accusation of communautarism, and that's what we start to see around those kind of activist groups. They're often accused of being somehow divisive, of trying to kind of be anti-republican in some way. And I think that's a really interesting kind of basis for all of that kind of discussion to take on. Yeah.
No, I think I think the kind of the conversation about the resistance or the kind of the challenges to communitarianism, I think, is more relevant in terms of thinking about the responses to recent attacks, rather than thinking about sort of the pressures of communitarianism as a possible motivating factor. I mean, one of the I think valid criticisms of some of the discourse around the attacks has been that there is sometimes a rush to sort of blame the French state. Or even if not to blame, to sort of develop a critique emerging out of the attacks, as if what the French government needs to do is change its attitudes towards racial and religious minorities. And oftentimes those critiques don't really work very well, at least in terms of explaining the motivations of the attackers. I mean, in this case, the person who attacked the teacher in Paris wasn't, as we already said, he wasn't French, and wasn't, he's not of an Algerian background or Moroccan background. And I think sometimes, I mean, there's also a problem with the way that we talk about terrorism more generally, at least within political philosophy, and that sometimes there's a kind of diminishment of the agency of people who carry out attacks. And you don't want it to make it sound like you think, here's this group of people who are becoming radicalized, as if there aren't, most of the people who are engaged in pushing back against communitarianism are doing so through academic work, through activist work, through politics and things like that. But in thinking about the kind of responses, I mean, I think what you were just saying there about the kind of Anglo-Saxon multiculturalism is really interesting. The French Minister of Education was recently talking about sort of importing these notions of intersectionality from American universities, and how it's corrupting the way that French students think of themselves, and this idea that part of what's gone wrong is education and the return to Republican values in the classroom, and how that parallels things that are happening in the United States and in this country with, I don't know when critical race theory suddenly became the great threat to British civilization. I mean, I feel like you'd be hard pressed to find a school that's doing more than one session in an ethics class on critical race theory. But we're starting to see this kind of specter of some form of multiculturalism as a threat to either Britishness or Frenchness or Americanness, or to like Western civilization and the grander critiques. But I guess this is just returning back to this problem of sort of universalism and communitarianism.
Yeah, I think first of all, schools are really important, and that is that's a really important point, because in France, schools are like quintessential as a vehicle for this idea of republican values, of universal values. These are seen to be, the same impulse, the same kind of political force that creates the idea of the separation of church and state is also kind of tied to that same force that creates French schooling. It's the Jules Ferry laws of the 1880s that create a separate, state schooling, takes it out of the hands of the church and brings it into the domain of the nation. And that I think is really important. Why? Because, well, the idea is that in those actual classrooms, they become ways to teach people about what it is to be French, what it means to be French. The idea is that you remove the church from having a role in that it's about kind of, finding a way to teach people about what France is. There's a very famous quote from Charles Péguy, who describes teachers at that stage as being the black hussars of the Republic. They go out there in uniform into the countryside, and it's like they're carrying the values at the end of a bayonet, or at the end of a kind of, whatever, chalk duster or something. But the idea is that this is about learning that exact idea. Even at the memorial service for Samuel Paty, you could see ways in which that became really important. So, for example, the letter written by Jean Jaurès, the great figure of the French left, to school teachers in Toulouse was read out. And he talked about the idea that people need to know what it is to be French and know France. And it wasn't just about adding up sums and kind of learning your letters. It was about understanding the laws and values that motivated what the Republic was. So first of all, I think it's really important to state that schools are, in that basis, a very strongly ideologized place, with it explicitly so within the French Republic. And we saw kind of things emerge around the idea that this is about teaching people national values. You can see that, like, from that period in the 19th century, people like Ernest Lavis, had this idea of he was a very famous kind of historian that wrote a lot of textbooks at the time. There was the famous one that was like, "Tu seras soldat," you will be a soldier. And it kind of taught people about this idea of what it was to kind of be French, to be a soldier, to defend the nation. There's other things. There's a very famous textbook by Bruno, which is it's called the Tour de France par deux enfants. The Tour de France by two kids. And the idea is literally, you just, in textbook, it's just two kids going all the way around France, experiencing the different regions and learning about France and all the rest. And it's meant to teach kids about what France is. But what comes from books like that is this phrase like "nos ancêtres les Gaulois," our ancestors the Gauls. Okay, and that's interesting. You look at someone like Lavis's textbooks, and he has images of schooling in Algiers, and he says, well, look, here we've got some nice European children sitting next to nice Arab children. They're both learning the same lessons and they're doing the same things. And his point there was about this idea of exportable universal values. And so the ideas of the Universal Republic, its vehicles for expanding its universalism, are notionally the French language and the French schooling system. But that means that you have children growing up at that stage in the, in Dakar or in Algiers, who go to school and learn about nos ancêtres les Gaulois. They learn about their ideas that, their ancestors were the Gauls. They had blue eyes. They were big guys. They looked like Vercingetorix, a bit like Asterix, They resisted the Romans and all the rest of it. Now, that's empirically not true. If you're growing up in Dakar at that time, it's, for many of those people, it would be false. But at the same time, it conveys a value that is something quite different. Now, I think that's important because that gives us a vision of a kind of different type of schooling in the first instance. Now, in terms of that critique from the education minister, he's really pushing back against what he sees as universities as well. And like you hinted at there in kind of ethics classes and all the rest of it, he's pushing back against what he calls, and there's again this new phrase that's crept into, well, not new, but it's crept more into the kind of the discourse in France, which is Islamo-gauchism. Now, that's a tough one because, again, it ties up really a very, very like chauvinist vision of those kind of values, a kind of powerful restatement of those values against any attempt to kind of claw away or kind of put division in that sense. Somebody like I said at the start, somebody like de Gaulle, the idea was, how do you govern a nation with however many types of cheese? And the idea is that France is a kind of naturally kind of vociferous, kind of divisive place, and that it needs a strong state and strong universal values to allow it to do all its own things, but to draw the state together. And the idea is that anyone that tries to chip away at that state, to chip away at that universality, is in some ways trying to kind of chip away at what it means. But then I think there's also this idea of laïcité, which I think is maybe worth us talking about. But so, for example, what's your kind of vision of laïcité in terms of, or secularism? Because again, I think the two concepts are maybe a little bit different, but like,
Yeah. I mean, so often there is a division drawn between kind of Anglo-American visions of secularism and laicite, and I'm always a little bit of two minds, because on the one hand, I appreciate that they are different in a way that I'll come back to in a second, but also I feel like that's often is sort of a way of either sort of side of saying, well, we don't have the problems that are like very clearly over there. And I mean, in the secular tradition sort of emerges historically this idea that people should be able to be free from religious persecution. They should be free from the state interfering in their religious lives. Whereas I think laicite is a kind of stronger notion, where it's effectively people being protected from religion as such, right? So it's not just that the state shouldn't be able to come in and tell you that you can't do this, but that you should be able to move through a society in which you are not going to be have religious images impressed upon you, or have to witness religious symbols, or at least that you shouldn't be in public spaces like in schools and places like that, which makes. I mean, I don't know what sort of French secondary school students learn, if they learn anything about religion, but I always find it very strange, because secularism itself isn't a sort of unified tradition, the way that. One of the interesting conversations I have with students is that we know which country is more secular, the United States or the United Kingdom. Almost everyone says the UK. And I'm like, have you seen a coronation? I mean, the Queen is, a kind of theological figure. You wouldn't dream of teaching religion, at least you shouldn't dream of teaching religion in an American state-funded school. And here, everyone's going to compulsory weekly acts of worship. I mean, to me, this is wild. Like, how can you understand yourself to be secular? But I do think that is a kind of softer version. And part of the reason that some of the debates that you see happening in France aren't happening in the UK, or they're happening in a kind of different way. Yes, I mean, would you see laicite as sort of distinct from sort of British secularism, or sort of Anglo-American secularism more generally?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's different. Now, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this because I am from Glasgow, but I think part of it's about Protestantism and Catholicism. Now, we're shaky ground already. But I think, part of it's about where it comes from, So laicite, as it's defined in French, is like this idea of the state's neutrality in the sphere of belief. It's about kind of a kind of vehicle of social cohesion, because what it's meant to do is kind of, like you said, push out those claims on the individual from the church, and instead like sweep those away, kind of evacuate that terrain, and allow instead the flourishing of those republican values. Now, part of that is because when the state was in formation, the Catholic Church was the vehicle of counter-revolution, and so it was the vehicle of like entrenched privileged elites. And so the idea of laicite was protecting a vulnerable state from entrenched privilege. And so it kind of comes from that idea of kind of trying to push back against an overreaching church, which could, especially one that's controlled, it was Catholic Church, it was controlled from Rome. It was a sense about, an idea of that it was kind of controlled from elsewhere. And so it kind of comes from a place that the state defended itself against that. Like that, it comes in 1905, the separation of church and state. That in itself is huge. It's like massively, it's massively divisive at the time. It's very controversial. It produces these huge debates. There's a wonderful example from one of my mates' books, a guy, Rob Priest, who wrote a book called The Gospel According to Renan. Now, Renan's an interesting figure because he's like a secular figure, but he also writes this Life of Jesus, which is a very kind of interesting book because it writes about him as a historical figure. Now, when they put up a statue to Renan in the town where he was born, in Brittany, in this town of Tréguier, Brittany is a very religious place. France is a secular country, but you go to Brittany and every street will, or not every street, but a lot of streets will have like a shrine or grotto at the end of the street and stuff like that. That's not secular. And when he put the statue to Renan up in the town square in Tréguier, and they put it up with its back to the cathedral, and there's these huge crowds, and like they're set off against each other, and they have military police in the middle to separate the two crowds, and somebody climbs up the banner of the the church to put a banner right across the steeple, and it says Vive la République, and then somebody climbs even higher and they put up a banner that says Vive le Christ. This idea that they set themselves in opposition, Christ and the Republic. So this idea of, I think, laïcité comes from that background. It's intended to be progressive, to free France from that influence of entrenched privileged elites. I think the real difficulty you have is where it starts to engage with minorities, especially those who face kind of socioeconomic inequality. It's a vehicle for resisting for resisting overbearing privilege, but it doesn't do so well when it tries to deal with kind of minorities from a position of power, I think. And I think that's where part of this issue comes from in terms of understanding, and why that need to have a counter narrative comes from groups like Indigènes de la République, like the Justice pour Adama campaign, like other places that try to look at the very real socioeconomic inequality that exists. And there, I think there are separate debates going on, but which are about defining the values of the Republic. And they're both ambitious because they both try to, I say both, I'm not kind of reifying sides of campaigns, but like both narratives of the state are around whether or not the state can be ambitious about what it wants to do, either in preserving its totality or in kind of realizing those universalist promises of equality. And I think that's one of the real tensions behind it as well, because both sides are aspirational,
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're just saying there about the kind of maybe like laïcité working in a kind of in a smaller sphere, but then when encountering religious minorities, who I mean, we're always there within the French Republic, but it's when trying to extend it to issues that pertain to religious minorities that it becomes trickier. And I think for me, that's part of the reason that I'm always like, while like I fully admit that laïcité and secularism are distinct traditions and like are deserving of their own analysis. I mean, for me, the thing that I find most interesting about contemporary work on secularism and laïcité is this notion that what is happening in secularism is the continuation of a form of Christianity, and the secularism as a kind of universal prospect, to go back to an earlier topic, is always carrying along some hidden particularity, which it can't acknowledge because secularism's promise is precisely its universality. And I think both secularism and laïcité have aspects of that. And often when they're trying to sort of position each other as further apart, it's as a way of kind of denying that.
Yeah.
I think so. We've been going for a while, but so maybe one more thing before we start to open it up to questions. One of the interesting things that's been happening is the way that the French state has been responding. So you have these press conferences, and I mean, it's bizarre now that we can talk about tweets and the way that the French state is tweeting its response.
Yeah.
And Macron saying like you can we will never abandon our cartoons, and then there's this kind of a kerfuffle, can we say, about the Financial Times and some op-eds about Macron. And I'll let you describe that. I'll let you describe the sort of kerfuffle, and then I'll say something what I think is interesting about Macron's response.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's it's exactly as you're describing. It maps on to this discussion of kind of French political definitions and this idea of a kind of Anglosphere as well. Now, of course, you had kind of an editorial written in the Financial Times, which slightly misrepresented one of Macron's speeches, which he made before the murder of Samuel Paty or the knife attacks in Nice, right at the start of October. He made this big speech in Les Mureaux about ideas of Islamist separatism, and he talked about the need to kind of bring in some kind of like centralization, some kind of like idea that France would sponsor kind of in some ways good kind of imams, and kind of try and foster a kind of, or insulate French Muslims from a kind of brand of Salafism, or the idea that France could somehow kind of try to cut itself off from those kind of different influences, the kind of Iranian influences as they kind of see it, as it were, where those things come from, that debate's been going on since 1989 and beforehand. What happens in Financial Times is there are a series of op-eds that are printed, and some of them are fair, some of them are quite bad across the press. There's one in the New York Times which is dreadful. The Financial Times one is okay, but it kind of pushes the line a little bit, and it does misquote Macron. But it's basically the idea that in some of the reactions, the French state strays towards Islamophobia. Now, there's a difficulty here because there's a nuanced debate to be had, I think, about the dynamics of global terror and about the ways that radicalization happen. And that's the kind of thing that Macron's talking about when he talks about Islamism. There are debates to be had about socioeconomic inequality in France, about the idea that, as my friend Emile says in his book, why is it that a girl sitting on the metro wearing a headscarf is more likely to be spoken to about laïcité than the nun sitting opposite? Why is it that a young black man in Lyon finds it more difficult to exercise his freedom than his white counterpart? These are kind of issues about kind of difficulties within that. And likewise, there are debates to be had, about the ways that those Republican values map onto what France is now. But those are also separate debates, and they don't all need to happen at the same time. So part of the difficulty is there are kind of like ways that these things get kind of tied together through a kind of Anglo lens, and they tend to misrepresent France, as you said, as a kind of other, that it kind of exoticizes it and says, oh, these silly French with their commitment to these outdated values and all the rest of it. Now, the difficulty the Financial Times had is it printed this op-ed, and then it received a letter from a very influential reader. And that reader was Emmanuel Macron himself. And so he wrote to them and said, readers around the world look to the Financial Times for reliable journalism, for X, Y, Z. We don't assume that we have to check the facts all the time when we read your newspaper because we know your standards of journalism are rigorous. And hey, it's usually a pretty good newspaper, let's be honest. And he says he counts himself, your readers, of which I count myself one. And he writes into them and said, but by the by, I didn't say the separatism of Islam, I said the separatism of Islamism. And he said, and that is a key difference because that shifts it from being this idea of a clash of civilizations or something like that to being about a specific issue of radicalization. Now, some of the French response and some of the responses in France have been Islamophobic and will be Islamophobic. Some of the responses will be about specific issues around it. But again, it becomes this kind of odd totalizing impulse. And I think that often happens when we see discussions between the Francophone and Anglophone world, Again, we talked right at the start about this kind of fasciosa conflict. I think it moves back to that moment again of saying like, oh, those silly French, they're doing this, very excitable people, they must be about this, and this is, some of the difficulty was some of these op-eds kind of suggested that France really brought it on itself. And that I think was quite objectionable. Because what it did is it started to remove the idea of the crime that had been committed, and I think that was dangerous. So yeah, that's kind of like where some of that, if you say kerfuffle, I would say stooshy, came from in terms of this kind of debate, and where it came from. I
think that is I mean, it is interesting the kind of the way that's sort of essentializing France, which sometimes France does make easy. I mean, scholars of religion and who are interested in kind of issues about diversity and tolerance and race and religion I mean, there are pictures of French police officers sort of standing over women in burkini on French beaches, which have motivated many a student to want to learn more about religion and race. But I mean, I thought one of the interesting things in Macron's letter, which was at least for me, it seems almost like a kind of own goal. I've been part of your the British Isles long enough now to use expressions like own goal. Is the way that he talks about kind of gender separation from a very young age and girls as young as 3 or 4 wearing the full face veil, and a minute number of people in Europe are wearing that form of religious dress. It is minuscule, and again, often not because, or at least according to their own testimony, not because they've been forced to. So to repeat this idea, I mean, it's interesting that it immediately moves to questions of the veil. and something which is very unsubstantiated, that there is any significant issue with children that age being forced to cover their faces, which is not how most Muslims understand their own religious tradition. And so it seems so unfortunate that, and maybe in pushing back against unfair characterizations to varying degrees, Macron doubles down on this vision of Islam, which just re-entrenches the very problem that he was trying to address in the first place.
I think you're absolutely right, because he did use a couple of kind of anecdotes, and these weren't kind of substantiated anecdotes. These were kind of moral panic style discussions. And this is the difficulty, I think, of where these different debates kind of run together and fuel these kind of totalizing responses, especially when they come from a kind of defensive point of view, you know? I mean, leading into this moment, like even beforehand, this was a moment in which, you know, Macron had already been talking about definitions of kind of what the Republic is. And, you know, this idea, as we said, this speech, and it was 2nd October, I think it was, at Les Mureaux, where he talked about the need to kind of tackle Islamist separatism. This was before all of these ideas. And so what this tends to do is then kind of make these debates seem higher stakes, because it frames them in response to the specific tragedy. Now, I've always been one that says that I think that we ought not, as scholars, as thinking people, to look and credit the narratives of kind of violent attacks. Instead, we should treat them as crimes and look at the root causes of those crimes, but not treat them as messages or credit the narrative which those involved want to kind of portray. Because so often the intent is to create a monster of the state. Now, again, I'm not going to go into it just now because it'll take too long, but you could look at France's response to anarchist terror at the end of the 19th century. You know, the association of the Sadi Carnot was met with this kind of real monstrous state response. That was a mistake then, and I think it would be a mistake now. I think those ideas of the Republic are important. And I think where ideas like laïcité stop being kind of a vehicle for social cohesion, start to move towards being a weapon, I think the Republic becomes poorer for it. And I think really that is something to try and be avoided. So I think this is that in some ways it's a real test of what's meant by the idea of those French Republican values. It's a test, a bellwether for those things, I think.
Yeah, I think I might add a slight qualification in that. I think seeing them as crimes, but also at times political acts. And I think there is in the kind of conversations around terrorism that's linked to religion in some way, this very complicated question of, you know, how do we, let's go back to something I was saying earlier, how do we recognize the agency of the person who carries out this act? And what we might not allow their narrative to dictate fully our interpretation, but that narrative also has to be addressed in some way.
Sure.
This is getting into colleagues' research. You know, how do we might want to sort of, in a sense, intellectually protect religions from the behaviors that we find most reprehensible that are done in the name of those religions. But it's also the case that the people who are doing those things might see those acts in terms of their own religion, and it has to be addressed in some way.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And again, like yourself, I think I would probably defer to Hannah on this on this research, because she's the one looking into it directly. But I think that is important to understand where those. It's important to study those messages, because if we ignore them, then we learn nothing. But I just, you know, I often think in terms of like the immediate media discourse which surrounds it. The crediting of those narratives at times fuels a reaction, which can satisfy the desire of kind of strategic idea behind it. Yeah, perhaps.
Great. Well, we've been going for a while, so maybe it's a good time to open it up for some questions. I will do my best to notice like when hands go up. So if you're using the app, if you hover over the screen or at the top of your screen, you'll see a little sign that says raise your hand. So if you want to use that, you can ask a question that way. Or if you feel like I don't want to put my face or voice on camera, please feel free to use the chat. All right. Sorry, my thing. Yes. So Hillary, do you want to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Yes. The Republican value of equality seems to me to have been very much undermined by the arrangements made for where people from other than northern France, and often Islamic, are housed in what could be called ghettos, particularly around Paris. And it's very difficult to see how they could trust the French government and the Republic in that context. And I wondered if you got anything to say about that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Thank you, Hilary. First of all, about in the immediate years following the end of empire, we see really the development of quite shocking slums in France, often on the periphery of some of France's great cities. So the kind of what are often called bidonville. Bidon is like a jerry can, like a petrol jerry can. They were called bidonville because they were often constructed from corrugated tin or beaten out jerry cans. And you often talk about in 1968 the spark of the student protests. They occurred. Like looking on effectively to bidonville. You had student housing, kind of rundown student housing blocks situated directly opposite the ideas of slums, essentially inhabited by many people who had come to France largely from North Africa and the Mediterranean, and that was essentially the product of underinvestment. You're right. After that stage, you can then see the development of French community housing, what we call the HLM, and that has its own particular history. I mentioned before, one of my colleagues, Ed Naylor, has done some really interesting work on those, the development of those HLMs, and looking at the ways in which they often were quite strongly tied to concepts of what it meant to be French. But again, housing is always something that is extremely political. I read a really good book. I forget the exact name of it just now. It was written by, I believe, Nicole Rudolph wrote the book, and it's about essentially the evolution of French council housing. And one of the things it does is because, of course, the provision of council housing relies on visions of how people should live. And actually, there are specific disjunctures in terms of how France treats its different populations in terms of provision of council housing, but also in terms of, as you say, the way in which those slums developed in the immediate aftermath of the end of empire. So yes, I would say that there are, that is exactly the kind of thing, Hilary, that I was talking about in terms of grinding socioeconomic inequality. And I think those are the kind of realities that then undermine messages of equality and all the rest of it, because those things do, for many people, say, well, why is it more difficult for me to do this? You only have to look at in a very obvious way, like a film like La Haine, the very famous Matthew Kassovitz film, which again talked about the idea of the banlieue, and again we could see the ways in which the debates around discussions around the banlieue in the French imagination became the French political media imagination became racialized in many ways. After the riots of 2005 in response to police violence, we saw really swingeing crackdown measures. Of course, we famously had Nicolas Sarkozy describe people that lived in the banlieue and were rioting as racailles, scum, which he was going to hose off the street. This was about the way in which France conceives of those differences. In Paris, if you live beyond the périphérique, if you have a name that sounds Arabic, that means you will have different life chances. Those things are not equal, but they are also invisible under an idea which doesn't recognize the concept of ethnicity or religion as being a distinguishing factor of citizenship. But I would also say those ideas of extreme socioeconomic inequality are not unique to France, nor a unique legacy of French colonialism. I think those things are really important issues, but I think they are not helped or addressed necessarily by some values of the Republic. But I don't think they're necessarily created by those values at the same time. But you're right. Well, that raises the question of how can people trust some of those values? And I think that's exactly the issue that we can see develop. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those the kind of cruelties of universalism, and I would say again, I mean, to agree with you there, Andrew, not just in France but elsewhere, but that narratives of universalism in defending their universality often winds up sort of blaming people who aren't enjoying the privileges of those universal values for that exclusion. So you're not capable, or you're not integrating enough, or there's you have to continually defend that universality, because universal values are supposed to be universal. Revising universal values is often very challenging. They require very complex rewritings of history and things like that.
Yeah, I think, as you pointed out, like my point is as well, I think it's important not to kind of like romanticize some ideas and concepts of kind of inequality within France. It's no it's no coincidence that, for example, the Justice pour Adama movement responds to some of the same issues as the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. They're not importing US ideas, but they are responding to things that are happening within France, but are also happening within America. And they are kind of responding to them in a common language. And I think some of the real difficulty is that we're often, in terms of those, having different kind of coded debates about different things that address different ideas. And I think some of those government responses we spoke about, about Islamo-Gauchism, for example, that, there have been some dreadful things where I've seen kind of activists, Black female activists talking about ideas of the need for representation and the need for recognition of the rights of Black people in France, being accused of being kind of, complicit in the atrocities committed in response to against the kind of cartoonists at Charlie Hebdo, for example, and thereafter. Now that is, unacceptable. But that is a conflation of very, very different ideas, and I think it becomes very easy to kind of abstract the debate in that way. But I think it's all the more important that we therefore confront different ideas at the same time, and try to tease out those debates where possible.
Yeah, great, thank you. Other questions? Hands or chatting? Oh yes, David, go ahead.
Hiya. Thanks for this. It's been really interesting. I was wondering if you could expand at all on the pervasiveness and sort of how rooted this idea of sort of French identity is. So to liken it to British identity, you wouldn't have a political party thinking about questioning, say, Remembrance Sunday. It's much too much part of our identity. But then ideas of multiculturalism are being, to an extent, much more questioned and open for debate within Parliament. So I was wondering, is there this more debate going on in France about this kind of identity politics?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think it is definitely one. I mean, we only need to look at the runoff in the last French presidential election to see kind of different ideas of where that identity is challenged. There are a number of ways in which we can see this. A good example would be, so we were talking about laïcité earlier on. In 2016, the French state, the French Republic, banned the displaying of crèche, like nativity scenes in town halls at Christmas, because that is a religious symbol, as much, perhaps more so, than a headscarf. And that is a building of the Republic, of the state, it should be secular. So you can't display one there. Okay, that makes sense in a way. But then you could look at somebody like Robert Ménard, who was the kind of Front National, now Rassemblement National, kind of fellow traveller that was elected in Béziers in 2014. Now, he is a figure of the kind of the radical right, and after 2016, he has consistently put up nativity scenes in the town hall in Béziers, so that he can consistently be taken to trial, where they will be accused of kind of breaching the separation of church and state and all the rest of it, and he can say, no, this is about culture. This is about French culture. It's about ideas of how we understand these things. I mentioned yesterday, it was the 50th anniversary of de Gaulle's death. Everyone described the idea of a pilgrimage to Colombey-les-Deux Églises, and this idea, a pilgrimage to go to see the tomb of de Gaulle. Now, first of all, there's this kind of constant thing in French kind of political rhetoric, and there's a joke about the idea, well, Colombey-les-Deux Églises become Colombey-les-Deux Mosquées, you know, this idea of like what de Gaulle talks about, his fears in some way, in a kind of offhand way, and that's been very much seized upon by ideas of the right wing. And we can see ideas that from the French political right, which have spread out in a very identitarian way. Renaud Camus, the idea, the kind of the progenitor of this like great replacement idea, and actually our boss Hugo has written a chapter on Renaud Camus, and he's kind of the one that wrote this idea, which you now see kind of is everywhere in kind of French discussions. But I mentioned the pilgrimage idea in 2015. Les Républicains politician Nadine Morano talked about this idea of France being a country of the white race, and she was roundly criticised, as she rightly should be. She protested that she was only quoting something that de Gaulle had said. Now, again, de Gaulle didn't say it in a kind of political sense. It may have been present in some, you know, lecture. Again, de Gaulle was a man born in the 19th century. We're talking about different times and different people. But again, to kind of reflect on that afterwards, what she did in a very public way in 2015 was went to commune with the tomb of de Gaulle on his grave, to kind of like to think on what this meant, and refuse to repudiate the words of the general in this general sense. So you're absolutely right. There is very much this kind of idea around it. I mentioned my friend Emil's book. The concept he uses to discuss this is neo-republicanism. The idea of quite kind of strong kind of concepts of nationalist challenge, and which are often voiced in the language of the Republic, and attempts to redefine Republican values to mean specific and often quite kind of expansive and different things in a big way. So yeah, I absolutely agree. There is very much this debate going on, but I also think that French political discussions have informed those specific identitarian debates which have occurred elsewhere as well.
I mean, yeah, just to pick up, I mean, something you said a moment ago about the kinds of the conflation of Christianity and French culture. I mean, this is something you see happening across Europe. And I think the kind of go-to reference for many people working in religion is the court case Lauzi versus Italy, which is a court case that went to the European Court of Human Rights. And in some of the Italian decisions leading up to going to the Court of Human Rights, there was these, I mean, incredible things being written by judges about how the court case was about the hanging of crucifixes in state-funded schools and classrooms. And a parent had objected to this because it's a religious symbol, state-funded school. Your kids shouldn't have to, go to do their math class with, a crucifix hanging on the wall. And then the response to her complaint was basically that the crucifix is no longer just a religious symbol. It's a symbol of European culture. And as European culture is itself secular, and secularism emerges out of Christianity, the crucifix is itself a kind of symbol of secularism. And that's not an extremist saying that. That's these are legal figures. And I think, I mean, one of the things that is very interesting, but also very challenging in our kind of present moment is trying to figure out, what are the connections between racial identities, how are sort of racial identities being expressed through religious identifications, how are, worries about, the West, Western civilizations themselves, ideas that are heavily influenced by racial and religious thinking, being constructed over and against the perpetual other of Europe, which has always been Islam, despite the fact that Islam has been present in Europe for quite some time. I see that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So no, I was going to say, we haven't even mentioned somebody like Michel Houellebecq in all of this as well. And we're not going to get into it there, but this is a big mainstream discussion. That man sells a lot of books playing on exactly those kinds of fears and kind of exactly what you describe.
Mark Mason, you have your hand up.
Hello. Thank you both. That was really, really interesting, absolutely fascinating. I salute you both for a really great conversation. It struck me, and I'm probably wrong, but it struck me that really what you were both doing was having a fascinating critical dialogue about narratives. And there were some questions raised about how to respond to certain narratives, the ways people might engage with narratives or not. And of course, it strikes me, and again, I may be wrong, that there is a far more, or the use of the term narrative is something that one hears much more in the popular media, in sort of media cycles, in political commentaries at the popular level. So it's really a connection. It's really a sort of question about how you connect, both of you, the work that you do at an academic level, which you could describe, as examining the rhetoric of narratives. You could call it discourse analysis, you could call it what you want, but essentially it's interrogating narratives or critiquing narratives. How you connect up what you do with discussion of narrative at the popular level of political and media commentary. So what value narrative analysis in terms of educating the public, what traction do you think might be achieved by an increasing examination of the rhetoric of narratives at the public level? Does that help in these kinds of discussions? Does it help people at a popular level to understand the way tropes are used? Does it help people to understand how narratives can install rather dubious epistemic and ontological claims and become rather self-satisfied and complacent? Does it help people to understand that narratives can install essences and feign that that's how things really are? I mean, what or is narrative just kind of doomed just to be another word that is kind of co-opted, and kind of absorbed by the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. What I immediately thought of is, I think way back in 2015, I wrote a blog post when I was talking about, sadly, the last wave of attacks against France, when many of these same debates were being had. And I talked, and likewise talked about that, reflected on that in the context of where we'd seen those discussions in Britain as well. And I think I called it something like memory in an age of narratives. And I think, the ideas behind it, exactly what you say, I think are really important. First of all, in terms of how we can confront and engage with ideas that are put across in the political sphere, but also how we engage as responsible citizens with the media around us. I think ideas of narrative and some kind of media literacy are things which spread quite dramatically because of, I think, a greater engagement with politics through things like social media. I think there we start to see where people are drawn into kind of global conversations. And I guess what I see, in one way, I think the role of every historian is to come into any debate and say, I think you'll find it's a bit more complicated than that. But on the other hand, I think, when we see people having kind of more critical engagements with media, with narratives, stopping to question. One of the things I always kind of try and instill in every student and try and drum out of them from A level is this idea that people talk, everyone comes in talking about bias and they want to kind of discard something because it's biased. Instead, I think in a much more mature way, we can start to look at kind of ideas of perspective and different narratives and clashing, interacting narratives, perhaps intersecting narratives. And actually then from those perspectives, we can ask, as French people do, of anyone that's writing, if you're a historian in France, one of the questions you'll be asking is, where are you writing from? And they don't mean the bedroom or the suburbs or whatever. They mean, like, what is your kind of political outlook? What are you approaching this from? What's your mindset when you're asking these questions? And I think exactly that, as people become more aware of these kind of ideas of understanding and dissecting and being critical of media, I think that can only be a positive thing. There can be a pessimistic trend, I think, in order to kind of dismiss people's ability to do that. But I am, I think, Panglossian constantly in my optimism that people can do better within a sphere of kind of interconnection. Not in some Hegelian sense of moving towards the Weltgeist or something like that, but people can kind of connect and make decisions in a more critical way. And so I hope within that there are kind of spaces to do that. We even see it in terms of the expansion of like strategic comms language. People now talk about frames and all the rest of it, not just people that work in comms. So I hope and believe that people can find the tools within this, and I hope that doing kind of public work contributes to developing those tools for people as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna do my best to walk past the references to Hegel and optimism. That's very difficult for me. But I mean, I think I often say that. Well, I mean, often to friends say that, like, I think the great hope for a philosophy degree is that it makes you go like a little bit more, and that you're sort of suspicious of surface level narratives. And I think for me, so I work in a kind of subfield of a philosophy called political theology, which is a misleading name, but what can you do? Which is very interested in genealogy, at least in the Foucauldian sense, not in trying to trace something back to its authentic origin, as if to say that then can give you essential information, but precisely in understanding how what gets sort of elided or reframed in the construction of narratives. And trying to understand the history of those narratives, and and how narratives change over time, but those changes themselves are sort of removed from the narrative of the narrative itself. And I think all of that's very important for understanding the kinds of issues that we've been talking about. I mean, I think the one fear I have about the language of narratives is that it becomes all about narratives. And in this sense, I think I always sort of like postmodernism or aspects of postmodernism, but sort of step back from it slightly, because a lot of the work that's going on now in sort of social epistemology or feminist political thought places a real emphasis on kind of objectivity and being able to make objective claims about the world. And Catherine McKinnon has a famous quote, a famous feminist philosopher who says that women know about the objective world because it hits them in the face. And being able to make objective claims about social reality are important. So it's not all perspective. But those that objective reality is always going to come in a narrated form. So you can't escape the narratives, but it's not all narratives. And part of the interesting thing is seeing the ways that objective reality resists our attempts to narrate it.
Thank you both. That's really helpful. I can't resist. So I agree. Really helpful comments. But of course, the move that it's more complex than that, as Andrew and I both know as historians, is the classic narratival rhetorical move that historians make to shore up their importance. But nonetheless, I'm really grateful to both of you. That was fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. Any other questions? We have been going an hour and a half now, or at least we have. So we could sort of draw it to a close, but I don't want anyone to, any cautious people, it's your last chance.
Well, just while, if anyone's still thinking of something, just one of the questions you kind of posed to me before, we never actually discussed, is you asked me if I would have displayed the Charlie Hebdo cartoons in a class. And actually, I think it's really interesting because, again, we talked about these issues, and Samuel Paty was a model of discretion in terms of doing that. He gave people the chance to leave the room. He kind of couched it within a language of freedom of expression. He explained why it was going to happen, all the rest of it. Now, first of all, I think it's important we don't make Charlie Hebdo sacred in itself, because it's like a cross between Private Eye and Viz. It's not some great publication, which is an important thing, and it's also not without beyond criticism. But the interesting thing was, in the discussion just before that happened, I had a class on the day before that happened on a Thursday, and had chosen not to, when talking about the ACT and secularism, to display one of the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. First of all, because I kind of thought, I don't know if this is going to be useful or generate discussion within a context if it is decontextualized. But largely because I had then refocused the lecture on the things that Emmanuel Macron himself had said about the way in which individuals and the Republic were actually located. So the interesting thing was, I chose not to display it because Emmanuel Macron had made this kind of speech, which to me was fascinating, and had rewritten the lecture on that basis, and then gave the lecture. And as I was giving it, something dreadful happened in France when that man was murdered. And so there was a real kind of like weird kind of synchronicity there, which was quite jarring, I felt. But then made me feel in some ways grateful that I hadn't done it. In other ways, made me think maybe one ought to. I don't know. It is a challenging discussion, but I think, you know, what we have to see is very much the idea that Samuel Paty was someone who, in teaching these things, did it in a sensitive way, and I think that in itself is to be commended. It was a lesson specifically about freedom of speech in the context of where that was being discussed in a school, you know, focusing on Republican values. That's important, you know. It wasn't just done crassly to offend. It wasn't, you know, something dreadful. I've shown Charlie Hebdo cartoons, less blasphemous ones, at other times, you know, which have, you know, had negative depictions of the Queen, for example. But that's less likely to offend, except the most, you know, ardent royalist who might be a figure of fun anyway, you know, to be offended by a caricature of the Queen. There are differences in terms of that, but you know, it is a challenge. It is a challenging question, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree, and I think in part it's about how we sort of view what's the nature of the offense, or what's the dynamic of the offense that occurs, and in one of the modules I teach in the second year, the final reading we do is an essay by Saba Mahmood about the Danish cartoon controversy. And part of the point she makes in that essay is that it's not just about whether or not a cartoon is offensive, but also about kind of operating from a position in which you can't imagine being offended by something like a cartoon. And I think that's kind of where the trick is. And I mean, and for me, I wouldn't have the same kind of visceral reaction to that cartoon. But if I think about it in terms of something like, how would I react being in a classroom if someone used the N-word? And I mean, I know I'm clearly very white, but I think the kind of reaction I would have to that word, that is just a word, would be enough that I can't imagine what the benefit of saying it in the classroom would be. And I think it is, you know, it's thinking about, I'm not talking about Samuel Paty. I mean, I agree from what it sounds like, you know, what I've read in the news, it seems like he was doing his utmost to deal with it in a very sensitive way. So I mean, this is not about that specific reaction, but when we talk about events like this, I think it's often in terms of thinking, you know, why was someone offended by that one image? Well, you know, it was never that one image. And I mean, the Archbishop Justin Welby was on the news the other day, and he was saying, you know, you know, if someone says something offensive about God, or, you know, insults God, we should we should trust that God is big enough to deal with that God's self. And I was sort of watching this, feeling slightly annoyed, thinking, well, of course, you know, those cartoons aren't drawn to offend God. They're drawn to offend Muslims. Maybe in a kind of humorous way, or as a way of sort of, you know, in a way doing something which is in a crass way, trying to express some of the values of France, and, you know, and being willing to make fun of oneself and things like that. But, you know, I think we often see these incidents in a way which abstracts them from much longer histories of the way that, you know, images and ideas and words are circulated, so that we say, well, you know, what is it about this one magazine cover, this one image, or this one thing that someone said to you in the street, and you just think, yeah, but I mean, it was never the first, was it? You know, it's probably a lifetime of dealing with this.
It is a real challenge, I think, for sure. But I feel we should probably stop talking.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Especially, I know some of you who are current students will have spent a lot of time looking at my face or Andrew's face this semester, and then and you coming and spending some of your evening to listen to us talk is very appreciated, and I hope it's been beneficial. I mean, I think the kinds of things that we teach in our department mean that we will be coming back to these kinds of topics over and over and over again. But we really appreciate you all coming.
Great. Thanks both. Wonderful.
Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers. Thank you very much. Lots of pinging.